On this episode of Pilot's Discretion, we tackle the impossible turn with flight instructor and airline captain Brian Schiff. He explains why he prefers to call it the possible turn, his advice for aspiring airline pilots, and what it's like to fly a Category 3 approach. Pilot's Discretion starts right now. Welcome, everyone. I'm John Zimmerman of Sporties, and today I'm joined by Brian Schiff. He's a captain for a major U.S. airline and is type-rated on a slew of airplanes, from the Airbus A320 to the Boeing 767 to the Gulfstream G5. He's also an active flight instructor, a frequent seminar presenter, and a writer for many aviation publications. Brian, welcome to Pilot's Discretion.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it, and thanks for making me sound so cool.
Well, we'll put you to the test right away here.
All right.
You spent a lot of time recently talking about what you call the possible turn. That is a turn back to the airport after an engine failure on takeoff. And conventional wisdom says this is a terrible idea. Go straight ahead. Never try to turn around. Why do you disagree with the conventional wisdom?
Well, I don't want to say I have a blanket disagreement with the conventional wisdom, because in general, if you have open fields in front of you and plenty of options, then I am all in favor of continuing straight ahead if you lose an engine in a single engine aircraft shortly after takeoff. But if you are flying out of an airport where there really are no options, and there are many of these airports, I can name several here in California, and I've seen others around the country where there is nowhere to go except the runway, then I have been advocating, and I've done this on the heels of my father's last 40-something years of studying the topic and teaching it to me as well, that I condone it if you're prepared for it, if you attempted it, and you know the limits of yourself and your airplane, and it wouldn't be more hazardous not to turn back. In other words, what's in front of you is more hazardous than what's behind you, and you've already determined what you can do in your airplane. So there's a lot of ifs there to make it possible.
Yeah, I often think about this. I fly in a Chicago Midway sometimes, and I always think about taking off there from those runways. Where is the place I'm supposed to set it down, landing straight ahead there? The towers on the lake, or the tightly packed neighborhoods right around the airport?
Right, and I never would say always or never, because usually when I say always or never, I'm usually wrong. So there's every airport, every takeoff, every airplane with every pilot has a distinct fingerprint to it, and that decision needs to be made beforehand. So if you are at 1,000 feet, say 1,500 feet in a 172 with nothing but houses and schoolyards and children in front of you and a perfectly good long runway behind you, would it be safer to go straight ahead and crash into the houses and schoolyards, or would it be safer to turn around and make it back to the runway? Well, if you're at 100 feet, you're not going to turn around. If you're at 3,000, you might turn around. So what I'm advocating is learning where the line is, where you can do it and where you can't. Where does the turn back turn into just flying back to the airport?
And does it vary by airplane? I mean, you mentioned Cessna 172 there. If I'm in a lightly loaded 172 versus a Baron or something, well, bad example, maybe with two engines, but does it matter which airplane I'm flying? Does that have a big effect on this turn back calculation?
The type of aircraft you're flying is not affected or should I say, my technique doesn't vary much by the type of aircraft, because you're going to use the technique that my father started, that we have kind of worked out together to determine the altitude. Now, you may determine that in a heavily loaded Bonanza, that altitude might be 3,000 feet, or you may determine that you can't do it at all. But going through the practice of learning if this airplane can do it, some aircraft can't. So absolutely, to answer your question, yes, some aircraft would not be able to do this at all. Others will do it easily. For example, I have a Citabria, and by the time I get to the end of the runway, I'm over 1,000 feet above the ground. If I turn around, I can't get down to the runway. So for varying reasons, different aircraft have different limitations. But what I'm advocating, is that a pilot learn what their aircraft can do, so that maybe they stay away from airports where there's no option after takeoff.
And what's a safe way to do that? I mean, I assume you're not advocating a pilot go up and pull the engine at 600 feet and see if they make it back. So what are some strategies for safely practicing or evaluating this?
Well, the strategies that I've been teaching are to, obviously, you want to do it with an experienced instructor uh, with you, but do it at altitude. And so when you get up to a safe altitude, I recommend basically seeing how much altitude the aircraft is going to lose in a 45-degree bank turn, 360-degree turn at glide speed with the power back at idle. There are many criticisms about, well, at idle, you're going to have a little bit of residual thrust versus a windmilling engine is going to have more drag versus a stopped prop and all that. Well, we don't know what caused the engine failure. So there's so many variables in there, including density, altitude, and varying weights of the aircraft. So those, I advocate adding a 50% buffer to whatever altitude it takes you, however much altitude it takes you to lose to make that 360-degree turn. For example, you go to you climb to a cardinal altitude at some speed between Vx and Vy. Passing that altitude, you pull the power back, wait 5 seconds for the response time, the what just happened, the pilot response time, and then pitch down 45-degree bank turn and see how much altitude you lose from that cardinal altitude. If, for example, you lose 800 feet in a 360, add 400, add another 50% to that and call it 1,200 feet. And that's the height at which you would not turn back to the airport if you're below. And that altitude will diminish. It'll get smaller with every practice you make. The first time I tried this, I think I lost 1,000 feet in a 172. The second time I tried it, I lost 700 or 800 feet, then 700. And finally, when I got good at it and learned, okay, these are feelings I'm not familiar with on flying the airplane. The flight controls are different. It required, it took more pressure for this and that. So it takes several attempts to learn how much pressure, how much pitch change, and all of that to really hone the skill into determining the least altitude you're going to lose during that turn.
Yeah, I would echo that. I've flown a Pilatus PC-12 for a number of years now. And we practice this every year in recurrent training. And it's not natural the first few times you do it. But once you practice it for a while, there are some of those reactions, the push forward, don't just hang on to the yoke while you stall, really crank it around. 15-degree bank's not going to get it done. Some of those things that once you practice it, make a huge difference in performance, but it is the type of thing you have to practice so that you can make the right reaction. I don't think it comes naturally to anybody.
No, it wasn't natural to me. And I had, when I started doing this seriously, over 20,000 hours, and half of that in GA airplanes, and it was unnatural to me. So yeah, it needs to be practiced, and a pilot needs to feel comfortable and proficient with it. If not, then don't attempt it. Just decide that, hey, I'm a pilot who is not going to ever turn back. And then maybe you don't go to an airport where your only option is turning back.
Another topic you've written about many times over the years that I've enjoyed reading is automation-dependent pilots. You wrote in an article, quote, "The autopilot's engage switch should not be a pilot's disengage switch," which is a really great way to say it. And obviously, it's hard to disagree with that. But I'm curious how we find the balance there between manual flying skills, which are still as important as ever, and new technology. How do we have the best of both worlds there?
Well, it comes from self-discipline. And I think when a pilot is flying an airplane, you don't turn on the autopilot and pick up a magazine and start reading it, or pick up your Sporty's catalog and start shopping. you turn the autopilot on because it's helping you. And so I've also said, I think in that same article that you were quoting, that the autopilot should be used as a tool, not a crutch. And so if you're relying on it, that's when you know you're doing something wrong. So pilots need to be self-aware. How am I using this autopilot? Am I turning it on and then just relinquishing total control of the airplane to the autopilot while I go divert my attention? No, you need to be actively monitoring what the autopilot is doing at all times with your hands ready to grab the flight controls and disengage the autopilot. So pilots need to be disciplined about not becoming an automation junkie and just totally relying on it because it has worked so faithfully before. All these years does not mean that it's going to continue to do so, or that you as a pilot may not ask for something you didn't intend to ask for, like being in a heading mode when you think you're tracking a nav.
Are there some things pilots should be doing during regular training, either as a part of adding ratings or just recurrent training every year? Are there some things they can do to make sure they're not becoming autopilot dependent?
Well, absolutely. And in fact, this became an issue at the airlines so much so that they were advocating that we hand fly certain approaches and so many legs. If we have a short leg, try hand flying the whole leg. But what we're really teaching is, and I think instructors need to get involved with this, and this might be a good seminar, but knowing the proper level of automation. There are multiple levels of automation, full automation and then fully manual. And in between, there are different stages. But knowing when to use full automation and when to use full manual and all the stages in between, and knowing the appropriate level of automation for the operation at hand is critical. I've had co-pilots in the airline. We're cleared for a visual approach. It's clear in a million miles. And then they start typing on the FMS and tweaking the knobs on the autopilot. And I just want to slap their hand and say, click, click, grab a fistful of flight controls and throttles and look out the window. And that's what pilots need to do. And they need to do that regularly. So just don't get so reliant on the autopilot every time you go flying.
I think you make a great point there too, that it's not necessarily a binary thing. There is room between fully engaged autopilot and, hand flying raw data there, especially in modern cockpits now with flight directors or with all the different tools we have. There's sort of a spectrum there more than just an on-off switch that maybe not enough pilots think of it that way.
Right. And there is some have auto throttles and some don't. Some have flight directors and some don't. Some have, some kind of flight guidance or GPS that maybe will do an overlay on raw data and some don't. So that's all aircraft dependent, but definitely need to understand the different levels of automation. In fact, I had a fellow flight instructor call me this morning and say, is there any practical purpose for teaching a VOR approach raw data in an airplane like a Cirrus? And I said, yeah, to pass a check ride. But, you're going to use the GPS and the overlay, but like we're taught at the airline, we need to use the raw data as our primary source on a VOR approach, on an approach that's not an RNAV, for example. We can use the technology, but we have to know that the VOR needs to be tuned, identified, and a radial set so that you can back up your automation. I was flying down in Mexico, going into Mexico City one time, and I noticed I had the VOR tuned for a jet route, just for an airway. I had the VOR and radial set in my VOR, but I was navigating via GPS and noticed that the needle started swaying off to the side. And just as I noticed that, ATC came and asked to say position. And I noticed that the GPS light came on then, that GPS integrity had just waned. And so that's something to keep an eye on, especially in this day and age with all the GPS jamming and military games that are going on in some areas.
So you mentioned airlines. That's where you spend a lot of your time. And I'm curious your advice now. Airlines are hiring again after a COVID pause. It seems like the demand is back there for new people coming into the industry. What's your advice for a new student pilot who wants to get on that track towards an airline career?
That's a great question that I think I've been asked a lot, because I have a lot of people thinking either they want to change careers because they recognize the demand, they recognize the improvements in our working conditions and so on and so forth. As a young person getting into this, I would say, and I give this advice when I go do job fairs and things like that, that don't get a ticket, don't get a DUI, don't hang around with people who do drugs, don't get into bad crowds. That kind of reputation, or, I've interviewed many pilots at the airline who are trying to get a job, and we look and they got a DUI. And now that presents an interview option here. What happened here? And so if you made a mistake as a kid and learned from it, and you've had a change in behavior as a result of that, then okay, we'll consider that. But if you got a second DUI, I just don't think you're going to get an airline job. And even with one, there are a lot of pilots who want this, and we're looking at people with good judgment. That said, there are some who say a pilot's license and a pulse will get you a job these days because of the shortage that's looming. But that's not necessarily true. Like at our airline, we have thousands and thousands of applications, and we are able to discriminate. So follow the rules, don't get into a bad crowd, and try to learn as much as you can about aviation. And half of that battle is just showing up. I've had some young students recently who, they show up for their for their training flight, and they go home and they don't read. They get back on the video games, or they're going to do whatever they got to do, and they show up, and I can tell that they haven't studied. you need to get into it. There's so much more than an instructor on a lesson can teach you, or watching a video on YouTube can teach you, and likely may be incorrect. So study, study, study. Read as much as you can about it.
And how about life as an airline pilot? You've been through some ups and downs like most airline pilots. What's your advice for sort of riding out the ups and downs in an airline pilot's career?
Well, early in my career, I had a senior pilot once tell me, a captain, he said, uh, kind of like gear up landings and furloughs and bad times at the airlines. He said, there's those who have and those who will. And he goes, you're not a true airline pilot until you've suffered one of our downturns. That said, just before COVID, our CEO at my airline said, we're not going to have any more of these downturns. The day of that is gone. This is going to be skyward. And then COVID hit. And guess who was annihilated? The airline industry. So I think it's good to go into it understanding that this is something that can happen. And for that very reason, have a backup plan. Have another skill that you can do. A degree in aviation is great, but it really is putting a lot of eggs in one basket. And it's not necessary, although helpful. It's not necessary. So learn some other trades, have a backup plan, but know that it happens. And when it does, it will turn around. So when times are bad in the airline industry, they get better. But when they're really good, they get worse.
Good advice. Brian, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with some more questions in a minute.
Sporty's is the #1 headset dealer in aviation with the guaranteed lowest prices, helpful advice from our team of pilots, and a no questions asked test flight guarantee. We'll give you 60 days to fly with your new headset. If you don't love it, send it back for an exchange or refund. To shop the full selection of headsets from Bose, Lightspeed, David Clark, and others, visit sportys.com/headsets. Now, back to Pilot's Discretion.
Brian, in a recent AOPA article, you talked about the changes in the airline world since September 11, 2001, on a 20-year retrospective article. And one thing you mentioned there that I think about a lot is the inability to visit the cockpit. I can still remember going up front to see the crew on a family trip when I must have been 8 or 9 years old. I can remember it was a United L-1011. It was just the coolest thing I'd ever done. Obviously, that's not possible anymore. Do you, as a pilot, miss that part of it?
Well, absolutely. And I went to work for a passenger carrying airline because I really enjoy interacting with the passengers. I remember going back in flight and taking a stroll all the way through the cabin, and mingling and conversing with the passengers and answering questions. I do miss that. And it has changed significantly from pushback to block into the gate. That said, I highly encourage, and I don't know any airline pilot who wouldn't encourage a young person or anybody thinking about getting into aviation to come on up to the cockpit while we're doing our pre-flight actions. If we have time to talk, we will. As long as that cockpit door is open before we push from the gate. I love it when people bring their kids up. Hell, I'll put them in the front seat and let the parent take a picture of them sitting in my seat. And sometimes that's all it takes to motivate someone. They see that picture of themselves sitting and like, you know what, I want to do that for a living. That's really neat looking. And so before we get out of the gate, I encourage people to come on up and visit. Or after we land and block in and we open the door, don't rush to get off the airplane. Wait, let everybody by. And when you see the cockpit door open, if it's not one of those pilots that darted out the minute he could and he's still there, come on up and see us. If we're still there, we're happy to talk to people. That's
good to hear. I'm not sure everybody knows that option, but I like the idea that if the door's open, it may be worth sticking your head in. So that's good to know.
Sure. And if you're a GA pilot and you're listening to this and you hear, you'd like to come up and see, you've seen nothing but light single engine airplanes and you want to see the cockpit and ask some questions, I encourage you to come on up and tell us you're a pilot and let's talk.
How about the less exciting part of it, but I know something you deal with every day, which is the TSA. Is there a simple change you would love to make that would make the TSA experience better at airline airports?
Well, there are two perspectives of the TSA experience. As a crew member, and another advantage to becoming an airline pilot, we get a known crew member card and we bypass that part of security. We go through a known crew member portal, which has some very stringent policies to it as well. And then there's the passenger perspective where you're waiting in line and you're harassed by TSA and given all the rules and treated like a child by a person in a blue shirt, and it's just not fun. Um, I would, what would I like to see? I haven't given that a whole lot of thought as far as what could change, but for the working crew, it's not too bad. They've really improved on that for the crew members. There are some airports, however, where they haven't. They don't have the known crew member portal, and we have to go through security, just like all of our passengers do, and it's miserable experience. It's a pain. It's the worst part. In fact, sometimes I joke that once we get through security, the hardest part of the day is over. I honestly don't have an improvement. It's a necessary uh, thing for us to have, and that's been proven. So I don't know the answer to that question. I'm going to be honest.
Most listeners will know that you grew up in an aviation family. Your father, as you mentioned earlier, well-known writer Barry Schiff. Many of us have been reading forever. But now, as I understand it, you're also the father of a younger pilot. I saw this recently that your son has learned to fly and got to watch Solo recently. Did you learn anything in that process about your father or about the father-son relationship being on the other side of that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I gained a perspective that I had no idea about when my son was flying. I'm teaching him to fly, and when he soloed, I didn't understand what my father was going through watching me solo until I watched my own son solo. And then I'm like, wow, Dad, I get it now. I see why you would be worried or why you'd treat me differently than other students. And you care more as a father watching your child go through the training. So I don't want to say I don't care about my other students. I do. I give them everything I can, but when it's your own kid, you just have a little bit more oomph in that care. So I have gained an appreciation for what my father must have gone through with me. However, I think my son made it easier for me than, than I made it for my own father, at least for the things he knows about that I did as a student pilot.
Your father said, I remember in one of his articles, that when you were learning to fly, it was important to him that the idea was yours, that you wanted to fly and it wasn't him forcing that on you. Do you agree with that advice in general for pilots out there, that maybe they want their son or daughter to take it up, but that's the right way to do it?
As I sit here now, I absolutely do. But back then, when I wanted to learn to fly and he made me pay for my flying lessons, he made me pay for the aircraft rental. Granted, I didn't have to pay for the instructor. Well, I probably did with chores at home, but when we rented the airplane, I had to pay for it. And until we got our own, then I had to pay for the gas. So he made me pay for it because he wanted me doing it because I wanted to, not because I had the opportunity to do it and it was just there, so I did it. So he never mentioned a word to me at all about his desire for me to learn how to fly. And one day, after being motivated by seeing him fly overhead in an airliner when we went to the airport to pick him up, I finally developed the courage to ask him, "Hey, Dad, what do I have to do to learn how to do this?" And it was as though he'd been waiting for me to ask that question for years, because he immediately took me out to the garage, opened up a cabinet, and pulled out a box full of everything he'd been saving for me: an E6B, a plotter, airplane flying handbook, as they called it back then, and everything. And well, he just let go like he'd been waiting for me to ask that question. And again, he never pushed it. I had no idea that he ever would have wanted me to learn how to fly. In fact, I probably thought otherwise. And then when I had to pay for it, I had to get a job to do it. And when I was 14 years old, I made like $10 a day. And every 2 weeks, I had enough for a flying lesson. And if I asked him, "Hey, can we go?" And he'd say, "Do you have the money?" And if I didn't have it, we didn't fly. And I got really pissed. I just didn't. I wanted to go flying, and he made me pay for it. But I appreciate that now, absolutely, because I did it because I wanted to, not because I had the opportunity to.
That is a great image of him taking out to the garage like he'd been waiting the whole time. That's fantastic.
Yeah, I'll never forget that. I remember it.
All right, Brian, at the end of all these podcast episodes, we like to do a segment called Ready to Copy, where I ask some questions and you give me your quick answer, just a gut reaction to each one of these. So are you ready to copy?
Yes, I am.
Like your father, you have flown a lot of airplanes. By my count, close to 100. Maybe you're even over that now. Will you ever match his number of airplanes flown?
I don't think I can match what he's flown. I think he's pushing 400 or 500 now, and he got a head start because he was doing a lot more writing than I was, and got to write about neat airplanes, fly them, and write about it. I don't think I'll catch him, but it won't be for a lack of trying.
You've flown among those airplanes two iconic business jets, the Learjet and the Gulfstream. Which one do you like better?
Wow, it depends on the mission. If I'm trying to get up as fast as I can and have some fun hand flying, I like the Learjet. It's a little rocket ship. If I'm flying a long haul flight, I like the Gulfstream. It's much more comfortable, very capable. It can get up above weather. It can get above the winds. So I would say both of them. It depends on the mission. But if I'm flying from LA up to San Francisco, I want that Learjet every day.
What is the life of a corporate pilot versus an airline pilot? Is that a career that more people coming into the industry should think about?
Absolutely. And that's a longer answer, but basically right after 9/11, for example, corporate pilot was the way to go. Right after COVID, when the airlines have their downturn, corporate is the way to go. But you've got a little bit more of a leash that you need to wear because you really don't have the schedule that you have at the airlines. I have done both. I prefer the airlines. I prefer having a schedule and having some control over my schedule. And, we have a lot done for us. We have our hotels booked for us. Our flight plans are filed for us. Now the pilot in command needs to look at that. And I've often changed my flight plan. So it's not like I don't regard it. But we have a lot. I don't load the airplane. I look at the weight and balance, but I don't perform it. A corporate pilot has a lot of work to do. And sometimes it's at the last minute and involves a lot of last minute lane changes. And I'm just not about that. So I prefer the airline life, but a pilot considering both should consider all those factors.
Describe a Category 3 approach for us in 5 words or less.
Sphincter clenching.
Okay, good one. What's the cockpit environment like those last 200-300 feet on one of those approaches? For a GA pilot who's maybe never seen anything worse than 502, what's it like?
Well, it's very structured. The call outs are structured. It's very scripted, and we practice it in the simulator. So I have a set of call outs, the pilot monitoring, co-pilot very actively involved. In fact, he's more important, I would say, to making call outs. And basically it's very quiet when everything goes right. And there are certain call outs to be made when anything is off. So when anything's off, I'll hear a call out, and I will hear certain call outs for stabilized approach or unstabilized and all that. And I will use that to help make a decision. So you're really, really primed to do the go around, unless you're interrupted by everything going right and the airplane lands. And then when the nose comes down, you start seeing some centerline lights going under your nose. And then, there's so much redundancy that having done it and practiced it in VFR conditions, I should say in VMC, and seeing what the airplane does and doing it over and over, that as a pilot, you gain confidence. In fact, they call it a flight confidence check, that we do it in VMC, see what it does. And with the triple redundancy that's required for a Cat 3 approach, that if everything's all aligned, everything's going to be just fine. And there's tighter limits, of course, with crosswinds and things like that as well.
Going to put you on the spot here. Will
Okay.
we see in the next 10 or 15 years, let's say, will we see a single pilot airline cockpit?
Yes. Yeah, I believe that's coming. Obviously, the study is already happening for it. The technology is in place, certainly. Am I in favor of it? No. I like having another pilot up there, especially when times get busy. There are times when I stop and think, wow, if this was a single pilot operation, it would not end well. And there are times when the two of us are really needed to be there. But I believe we will see it. And I have a friend who just got hired. I taught him to fly. He's a student of mine and a friend. He was flying for a regional and just got hired by FedEx. And I told him, okay, just be careful because they only may need half the pilots, because I think at the cargo carriers is where it's going to happen first.
All right. In addition to your airline flying, you're also a designated pilot examiner. You do everything in aviation, it seems like. So for an applicant preparing for a checkride, what's your one best piece of advice?
Yeah, that's a good one. I'll give the caveat that I'm not acting as one now. I'm qualified, and I will be doing it again soon. But my best piece of advice is that don't try to be perfect. The examiner knows you're not going to be perfect and that you will screw up. In fact, I just did a recent podcast for National Association of Flight Instructors, or I think it was a blog entry about it's not in the screw up, it's in the recovery by which we're measured. And so be okay with errors, but correct them. So if you're off on your altitude, you're not going to fail for that. What you'll fail for is not correcting back, is just disregarding a mistake. So be okay with not being perfect, but always correct back toward where you want to be.
Okay, our last question on this podcast is always the same one. You have one final flight, and we want to know, what are you flying and where are you going?
I'm going back in time to fly the Lockheed 1011 to Hawaii, like my dad did when he retired. Hawaii is my favorite destination. There's just something romantic about crossing the Pacific and getting up to the islands. And I just love the Lockheed 1011. I didn't get to fly it enough.
Brian, thanks for being on the podcast.
Enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to Pilot's Discretion, brought to you by Sporty's Pilot Shop. For more episodes and links to additional information, visit sportys.com/podcast. And if you have comments or guest ideas, email podcast@sportys.com. I'm John Zimmerman. We'll see you next time on Pilot's Discretion.